There's a voice that's been calling you since before you learned language, since before your first word, your first thought, shaped into the prison of syntax. It's been there in the gaps between your heartbeats, in the spaces where rationality dissolves into something older, something that knows you by a name you've never heard spoken aloud. The universe is speaking to you right now, in this very moment, but if you're listening for words, you've already missed it. If you're waiting for sentences to form in the cosmic static, you're tuning into the wrong frequency entirely. Terence McKenna spent his life trying to articulate the fundamentally inarticulate, to bring back reports from territories where language itself becomes a quaint artifact of a very peculiar primate consciousness. He understood something that our culture has systematically forgotten, that the logos, that animating principle of meaning that the Greeks tried to capture in their philosophy, isn't primarily linguistic at all. It's something more primal, more direct, something that touches you before cognition has a chance to wrap it in the comfortable clothing of vocabulary. The felt presence of direct experience, as McKenna called it, doesn't arrive wearing the costume of grammar. It arrives naked, immediate, undeniable. Consider for a moment the profound arrogance of believing that reality speaks primarily in English, or Spanish, or Mandarin, or any of the roughly 7,000 languages humanity has constructed to organize its consensus hallucination. These languages are remarkable achievements, certainly, but they're also filters, reducing the infinite complexity of being into manageable packets of meaning that can be transmitted from one nervous system to another. They're compression algorithms for consciousness, and like all compression, they achieve their efficiency through loss. What we call language is actually a very sophisticated system for agreeing on what to ignore, for collectively deciding which aspects of experience are worth encoding and which can be safely discarded as noise. But the universe doesn't speak in agreed-upon conventions. It doesn't respect the arbitrary boundaries we've drawn between subject and object, between self and other, between signal and noise. It communicates through what McKenna identified as a symbolic language, but we must be careful here. When we say symbolic, we don't mean symbols in the way your high school English teacher meant them, those tired metaphors of white whales and green lights across the bay. We mean symbols in the way they function in dreams, in psychedelic visions, in those moments of such intense beauty or terror that language simply evaporates and you're left standing in the presence of pure meaning. These symbols don't represent something else. They are what they mean. They bypass the interpretive apparatus entirely and inject significance directly into your consciousness. This is the language of synchronicity, of those moments when the external world seems to mirror your internal state with such precision that the distinction between inside and outside becomes meaningless. It's the language of the burning bush, of the voice in the whirlwind, of every mystical encounter that's ever been inadequately translated into scripture. The people who experienced these things weren't hallucinating or making things up. They were encountering the logos in its unfiltered state, and then spending the rest of their lives trying to stuff that encounter into the wholly inadequate container of human language. McKenna believed, and I think correctly, that we live in a symbolically rich environment that is constantly trying to communicate with us, but we've trained ourselves into a profound insensitivity to its messages. We've become like people born and raised in a library who have convinced themselves that the only way books communicate is if someone reads them aloud. We're ignoring the primary text in favor of very poor translations. Every culture that maintains a living relationship with what we reductively call the spiritual understands this. The Aboriginal Australians don't see the dreamtime as a metaphor. It's the more real reality, the template from which this physical world is continuously generated. The various ayahuasca-using cultures of the Amazon don't think of the forest as an inert collection of biomass. They experience it as a vast intelligence that can be consulted, negotiated with, learned from. What McKenna did, particularly through his exploration of high-dose psilocybin experiences, was to develop something like a cartography of these non-linguistic forms of communication. He discovered that when you dissolve the linguistic operating system that normally runs your consciousness, you don't fall into chaos or meaninglessness. Instead, you discover that there's been another conversation happening all along, one that your monkey mind chatter was drowning out. You encounter what he sometimes called the logos, sometimes the overmind, sometimes simply the other. The terminology doesn't matter because we're pointing at something that exists outside the jurisdiction of terminology. This presence that announces itself in the depths of the psychedelic experience isn't vague or abstract. It's often more concrete, more immediately present than ordinary reality. It's hyperreal. People consistently report encountering entities, intelligences, presences that communicate through means that make ordinary language seem like trying to transmit a symphony by Morse code. The information transfer is total, immediate, multidimensional. A single moment of communion with this presence can download what would take years to communicate linguistically. And even then, the linguistic version would be a pale shadow of what was actually transmitted. But here's what makes McKenna's vision so radical and so important. He wasn't suggesting that these experiences are mere hallucinations, chemical noise in the neural circuitry. He was proposing that the psychedelic state is actually a more accurate perception of what's always happening, that the logos is always present, always communicating, and that these substances simply remove the filters that normally keep us from perceiving it. The felt presence of direct experience isn't something that tryptamines create. It's something they reveal. They're tools for removing the cultural cataracts that prevent us from seeing what's been staring us in the face all along. This raises an unsettling question. If the universe is constantly communicating with us in this direct, non-linguistic way, why don't we notice? Why do we walk around deaf and blind to these transmissions? The answer, McKenna suggested, is that we've been carefully trained not to notice. Our entire educational system, our social structures, our scientific materialism, all of it functions as an elaborate filtering mechanism designed to keep us trapped in a very narrow bandwidth of experience. We're taught to trust only what can be measured, quantified, repeated in a laboratory. We're taught that subjective experience is suspect, unreliable, inferior to objective data. We're taught, in other words, to ignore the primary phenomena of consciousness itself in favor of studying its shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. The tragedy of this situation can hardly be overstated. We're beings capable of experiencing direct communion with the source code of reality, and we've convinced ourselves that the only valid knowledge comes from observing dead matter through instruments. It's as if we've been given the ability to taste, and we've decided that the only reliable way to understand food is through chemical analysis. The analysis might tell you about molecular structures, but it will never tell you what chocolate tastes like. There's a dimension of experience that is irreducible to third-person description, and that dimension is precisely where the universe does most of its talking. McKenna wasn't anti-science, not at all. He was pointing out that science, as currently constituted, has made itself deliberately insensitive to entire categories of phenomena. It's excellent at studying objects, but fundamentally incapable of addressing consciousness except as an object, which misses the point entirely. Consciousness isn't something you can stand outside of to study. It's what you're always already standing inside. It's the space in which all experience, including all scientific observation, occurs. And this consciousness, McKenna insisted, is not a random accident of matter organizing itself in certain ways. It's fundamental. It's the ground of being. And it's trying to talk to us. The communication happens constantly, if you know how to listen. It happens in the uncanny timing of events, in the dreams that seem to preview waking life, in the intuitions that prove prophetic, in the artistic inspirations that seem to come from somewhere beyond the personal self. It happens in nature, in the patterns that repeat across scales from galaxies to snowflakes to the branching of neurons. The universe is fractal, self-similar, and in that self-similarity, it's sending a message. This isn't random. This is a pattern. There is an intelligence at work here, even if it's not the kind of intelligence that sits down and has a conversation over coffee. What McKenna discovered in the heart of his explorations was that this non-linguistic communication from the universe operates through what we might call resonance, rather than representation. When a word represents something, it stands in for that thing, points to it from a distance. The word tree is not a tree. It's a sound that we've collectively agreed will make us think of trees. But the symbolic communication that McKenna encountered works differently. It doesn't represent experience. It generates it directly. It's more like music than like language. Think about how music communicates. A piece of music doesn't tell you that you should feel melancholy, or ecstatic, or contemplative. It makes you feel these things directly, without the mediation of concept. The meaning is inseparable from the form. You can't translate Beethoven's Ninth Symphony into an equivalent text any more than you can translate the color blue into a sound. The information exists in a different dimension entirely. This is precisely how the universe communicates. It doesn't send you messages about meaning. It causes meaning to arise in your consciousness through direct resonance. McKenna often spoke about the intelligence of nature, and this wasn't a poetic flourish. He meant it literally, though not in the way our culture typically understands intelligence. We think of intelligence as the ability to solve problems, to manipulate abstractions, to build tools and technologies. That's certainly one form of intelligence, the kind that humans have specialized in. But it's a very narrow definition. The intelligence that McKenna perceived in nature, and particularly in the plant alkaloids that can so radically alter consciousness, is more like a vast, distributed wisdom, an intelligence that isn't centralized in a brain or a nervous system, but that emerges from the relationships between things. The mushroom, for instance, doesn't have a brain, yet it produces psilocybin, a molecule that happens to fit perfectly into human serotonin receptors, and that generates experiences of impossible complexity and coherence. From a strictly materialistic perspective, this is a bizarre coincidence. Why would a fungus produce a molecule that causes apes to have mystical experiences? The conventional explanation is that it's a toxin, a defense mechanism. But anyone who has actually had a high-dose psilocybin experience knows that this explanation is laughably inadequate. The experience is far too specific, far too meaningful, far too educational to be dismissed as the random effects of poisoning. McKenna proposed instead that psilocybin is a tool for communication, that the mushroom is trying to tell us something, or perhaps that it's opening a channel through which something else can communicate with us. In the shamanic traditions that have used these substances for millennia, this isn't a radical idea. It's obvious. The plant is a teacher. It has information to convey. But this information doesn't come in the form of propositions or doctrines. It comes as direct knowing, as immediate apprehension of connections and patterns that were previously invisible. This is what McKenna meant by the felt presence of direct experience. It's not mediated. It's not interpreted. It simply is. In these states, you don't think about the unity of all things as an interesting philosophical concept. You experience it as an undeniable fact of your immediate reality. The boundaries that normally separate you from everything else become transparent, and you recognize that they were always somewhat arbitrary, cultural constructs more than natural facts. The separate self, that fortress of ego that you spend so much energy defending, reveals itself as a useful fiction, a convenient illusion that allows for certain kinds of functioning, but that is by no means the deepest truth about what you are. And in that recognition, something shifts. The universe is no longer a hostile or indifferent void in which you happen to find yourself. It becomes intimate, familiar, even friendly. McKenna often described the entities he encountered in deep psychedelic space as having a quality of intense affection for humanity, as if we were prodigal children finally coming home after a long and pointless exile. These entities seem to delight in making contact, in showing travelers the tricks and techniques of consciousness, in revealing that reality is far stranger and far more malleable than we've been taught. But we have to be careful here, not to slide into a kind of naive supernaturalism. McKenna wasn't proposing that we abandon rationality or critical thinking. He was saying that rationality, as we currently practice it, is incomplete. It's excellent for certain domains, for building bridges and curing diseases and calculating orbits, but it's fundamentally incapable of addressing the subject of consciousness from the inside. It can tell you about the correlates of consciousness, about which neurons fire when you have certain experiences, but it cannot tell you what it's like to be conscious. It cannot address the hard problem, as philosophers call it, of how subjective experience arises from objective matter. McKenna's proposal was essentially that we need to develop what we might call a participatory epistemology, a way of knowing that doesn't pretend to stand outside of experience, but that fully engages with the subjective dimension. This means taking seriously the reports from altered states of consciousness, not as mere curiosities or pathologies, but as valid data about the nature of mind and reality. It means recognizing that the scientific method, for all its power, is one tool among many, and that there are forms of knowledge that require different approaches. The symbolic language that the universe speaks operates at the level of myth, of archetype, of image. Jung understood this. He recognized that the unconscious communicates through symbols that carry numinous power, that seem to come from somewhere beyond the personal psyche. His collective unconscious is remarkably similar to what McKenna was pointing at, with his notion of the overmind, or the logos. Both are trying to name something that our culture has largely lost touch with. The fact that consciousness is not confined to individual skulls. It's more like a field, something that we participate in, rather than something that we possess. In this view, thoughts don't originate in your brain so much as they pass through it. Your brain is more like a receiver than a generator, tuning into various frequencies of the larger consciousness field. Most of the time, you're tuned to the consensus frequency, the narrow band of ordinary waking consciousness that your culture has taught you to privilege. But this is just one channel among infinite possibilities. The psychedelic experience, meditation, dreams, creative inspiration, even certain kinds of madness, these are all examples of tuning to different frequencies, of accessing other channels of the larger consciousness field. And what you discover when you change the channel is that there's a lot more going on than you realized. Reality is not the dead, mechanical universe that materialistic science describes. It's alive, aware, intentional. It's more like an organism than a machine, more like a conversation than an object. And you, far from being an isolated observer of this universe, are an integral part of its self-knowing, its self-articulation. You are how the universe becomes conscious of itself in this particular location, at this particular moment. This is the deep teaching that emerges from the felt presence of direct experience. You are not in the universe. You are an expression of the universe. The logos that speaks through nature, through psychedelic visions, through moments of clarity and inspiration, is also the logos that speaks through you, as you. There is no fundamental separation between the observer and the observed, between consciousness and its contents, between self and world. These are all useful distinctions for navigating ordinary experience, but they're not ultimate truths. They're more like the conventions of perspective in painting, useful illusions that help us organize experience, but that can be transcended when we're ready to see what lies beyond them. McKenna was fond of saying that the syntactical nature of reality is actually more syntactical than we imagine. He meant that reality is structured more like language than like matter, more like information than like substance. Everything, at the deepest level, is pattern, relationship, information, organizing itself in increasingly complex ways. Matter is just a very dense, slow-moving form of information. Mind is a faster, more fluid form. And what we encounter in the psychedelic space is information in its purest, most immediate form, unencumbered by the constraints of physical embodiment. This is why the beings encountered in these spaces often seem more real than ordinary reality. They're not filtered through the constraints of matter. They're pure pattern, pure information, pure meaning. They can shapeshift instantly because they're not bound by the laws that govern physical objects. They can communicate entire libraries of information in an instant because they're not limited by the serial, one word at a time structure of ordinary language. They are what language is pointing at, but can never fully capture: direct, immediate, total meaning. The implications of this are staggering. If reality is fundamentally informational, fundamentally linguistic in this deeper sense, then the universe isn't just speaking to us. It is speech. It is the logos articulating itself into manifestation. The ancient Greek and Hebrew mystics, who spoke of the word that was in the beginning, the word through which all things were made, were not engaging in primitive superstition. They were reporting on their direct experience of how reality actually works. The universe is a continuous utterance, a perpetual bringing forth of meaning into manifestation. And we, as conscious beings, have the extraordinary privilege and responsibility of being fluent in this language. We can learn to read the signs, to interpret the symbols, to engage in dialogue with the intelligence that permeates all things. This isn't mystical nonsense. It's a practical skill that can be developed through attention, through practice, through a willingness to trust experiences that don't fit into our culture's narrow definition of the real. The question that naturally arises is how, precisely, we might learn to hear this language that the universe speaks. If the logos doesn't communicate in words, if it bypasses the rational mind and addresses something deeper, how do we cultivate receptivity to its transmissions? McKenna had very specific ideas about this, ideas that went far beyond mere intellectual understanding into the realm of practice, of discipline, of what we might call a technology of consciousness. First and foremost, he insisted on the importance of direct experience. You can read about mystical states, you can study the reports of others, you can intellectually understand the concepts, but none of that is equivalent to actually entering these states yourself. It's the difference between reading a menu and eating a meal. The menu might give you some idea of what to expect, but until you taste the food, you don't really know. This is why McKenna was so insistent that people actually try psychedelics rather than just theorizing about them. He wasn't advocating reckless experimentation or hedonistic drug use. He was saying that certain substances provide access to states of consciousness that are otherwise nearly impossible to reach, and that these states contain information that is simply not available through any other means. But the psychedelic experience, while potentially revelatory, is not the only way to access the symbolic communication of the universe. In fact, McKenna argued that an over-reliance on substances could become a kind of crutch, preventing you from developing your innate capacity to perceive these deeper dimensions of reality. The substances are teachers, training wheels that show you what's possible. But ultimately, the goal is to develop the ability to access these states through your own efforts, through practices like meditation, through cultivating attention and awareness, through learning to recognize the symbolic language as it manifests in everyday life. This is where we come to one of McKenna's most important but often overlooked teachings, that the universe is constantly speaking to us through what he called the felt presence of direct experience, and that we encounter this presence not only in exotic altered states, but in the texture of ordinary life itself, if we learn to pay attention. The synchronicities, the meaningful coincidences, the dreams that seem prophetic, the sudden insights that arrive unbidden, all of these are examples of the logos breaking through into everyday consciousness. Carl Jung spent much of his career trying to understand and articulate this phenomenon. His concept of synchronicity was an attempt to name the way that meaning seems to organize events in patterns that are not causal in the ordinary sense. When you think of someone you haven't spoken to in years and then they call you 5 minutes later, conventional science has no explanation for this except to call it coincidence. But if you pay attention to your life, you'll notice that these coincidences happen far too often and with far too much specificity to be mere random chance. There's a pattern here, and the pattern suggests that consciousness and matter are interacting in ways that our current scientific models don't account for. McKenna proposed that these synchronicities are the universe's way of winking at us, of letting us know that we're not alone, that there's an intelligence guiding events in ways that serve our growth and evolution. But this intelligence doesn't operate through causal mechanisms. It works through meaning, through resonance, through the acausal connection of events that share a symbolic relationship. This is the symbolic language in action. The universe isn't pushing events around like billiard balls. It's orchestrating patterns of meaning, and we participate in these patterns whether we're aware of it or not. Learning to read this language requires a fundamental shift in how we relate to experience. Instead of always trying to analyze, to categorize, To fit things into our pre-existing conceptual frameworks, we need to learn to simply witness, to be present with experience as it unfolds without immediately trying to translate it into the familiar terms of our ordinary understanding. This is harder than it sounds. Our minds are constantly generating commentary, constantly trying to make sense of things, to predict what will happen next, to compare current experience with past experience. This mental chatter drowns out the subtler signals that are always present. Meditation, in its various forms, is essentially a practice of learning to quiet this mental noise so that the deeper signals can become audible. When you sit in silence and watch your thoughts without engaging with them, you begin to notice that there's a space between thoughts, a stillness that's always been there, but that you've been too distracted to perceive. And in that stillness, other things become apparent. You might notice the sensation of aliveness that permeates your body. You might become aware of the field of awareness itself, that luminous presence that contains all experience, but that is not itself an object of experience. You might begin to sense that consciousness is not produced by your brain, but is something more fundamental, something that your brain modulates but does not create. This direct recognition of the nature of consciousness is precisely what McKenna meant by the felt presence. It's not a thought about consciousness. It's not a theory or a belief. It's the immediate, non-conceptual knowing of your own nature as awareness itself. And once this recognition occurs, even briefly, it changes everything. You realize that you are not a small, separate self trapped in a bag of skin, anxiously trying to navigate a hostile universe. You are the universe experiencing itself from a particular point of view. The same awareness that looks out through your eyes is looking out through every conscious being. There is only one consciousness, appearing as many. This might sound like mystical hokum, but it's actually a direct report of what becomes obvious when you penetrate beneath the surface level of experience. The separate self is not a given. It's a construct, something that your nervous system creates by drawing boundaries, by identifying certain sensations and thoughts as me, and others as not me. But these boundaries are not absolute. They're permeable, contextual, often arbitrary. In altered states, in deep meditation, even in moments of intense presence during ordinary life, these boundaries can dissolve, and you recognize your continuity with everything else. This recognition is what the mystics of all traditions have been trying to point toward with their paradoxical language about union with God, about enlightenment, about moksha or nirvana, or the kingdom of heaven within. They're all pointing at the same thing, the direct experiential knowledge that separation is illusory, and that at the deepest level, there is only one thing happening, one consciousness playing all the roles, one logos speaking itself into infinite forms. But McKenna added a crucial element to this perennial teaching. He insisted that the logos is not static, not eternal and unchanging in the way that much mystical philosophy suggests. It's dynamic, evolutionary, moving towards something. History, both human and cosmic, is not just a random walk or a meaningless cycle. It's a trajectory, a story being told, and we are characters in that story with agency and choice. The universe is not just speaking to us, it's asking us questions. It's presenting us with challenges. It's inviting us to participate consciously in the evolutionary process. This is where McKenna's notion of the transcendental object at the end of time comes in. His idea that history is being pulled forward by a kind of strange attractor in the future, a point of infinite novelty toward which everything is moving. Whether you take this literally or metaphorically, the essential insight is powerful. We are not just passive observers of reality. We are active participants in its unfolding. The choices we make, the consciousness we bring to our lives, the degree to which we wake up and pay attention, all of this matters. It shapes the trajectory not just of our individual lives, but of the larger evolutionary process. The universe is speaking to us then, not just to inform us, but to enlist us. It's calling us to wake up, to remember what we are, to step into our role as conscious agents of evolution. And the first step in answering that call is to learn the language, to develop sensitivity to the symbolic communication that is happening all around us and within us at every moment. This means cultivating a different quality of attention, a more receptive, more contemplative stance toward experience. In practical terms, this might mean spending time in nature, where the symbolic language is most obvious. The natural world is saturated with meaning, with patterns that repeat across scales, with relationships that mirror the structure of consciousness itself. When you really look at a flower, not just glancing at it, but actually seeing it, you're encountering a piece of the Logos made manifest. The spiral of seeds in a sunflower, the fractal branching of a tree, the symmetry of a snowflake. These are not mere mechanical results of physical laws. They're expressions of the underlying intelligence that organizes matter into increasingly complex and beautiful forms. It might mean paying attention to your dreams, recognizing them not as random neural noise, but as meaningful communications from the unconscious, from that part of you that is connected to the larger consciousness field. Jung demonstrated that dreams speak in symbols, in images that carry multiple layers of meaning. Learning to interpret your dreams is learning to read the symbolic language. It's developing fluency in the way the unconscious communicates, which is also the way the universe communicates. It might mean noticing the synchronicities in your life, the meaningful coincidences that seem to comment on your internal state or to guide you toward necessary insights or connections. When you start paying attention to these patterns, you realize that they're not rare occurrences. They're constant. The universe is always sending these signals, always creating these patterns of meaning. We just usually ignore them or explain them away as random chance. What becomes clear as you develop sensitivity to this non-linguistic communication is that the universe operates through what McKenna called visible language. This is a challenging concept because it seems paradoxical. How can language be visible? Isn't language, by definition, abstract, consisting of arbitrary sounds or marks that represent meaning? But McKenna was pointing at something genuinely strange and profound, that in certain states of consciousness, particularly in high-dose psychedelic experiences, language takes on a visual, even tangible quality. Words become objects. Meanings become spaces you can move through. The distinction between signifier and signified collapses entirely. People who have experienced this phenomenon often struggle to describe it because it violates all our ordinary assumptions about how communication works. They report seeing geometric patterns that are somehow also ideas, colors that carry emotional and intellectual content, forms that are simultaneously abstract and concrete. It's as if meaning itself becomes perceptible, as if you can see thought in its raw, pre-linguistic form. This is the Logos not as a sequence of words, but as a living presence, a dynamic, self-organizing pattern of pure significance. McKenna believed that this visible language was not a hallucination, but a more accurate perception of how reality actually works at the deepest level. He proposed that we live in what he called a linguistically contoured reality, meaning that the structure of reality itself is linguistic, informational, symbolic. The physical world, in this view, is a kind of dense, crystallized meaning, information that has slowed down enough to take on the appearance of solid matter. But at the quantum level, as physics has discovered, matter dissolves into pattern, into relationship, into what can only be called information. This convergence between ancient mystical insights and modern physics is not accidental. They're both probing the same deep structure of reality, just from different directions. Physics approaches it through mathematical abstraction and experimental observation. Mysticism approaches it through direct experience and contemplative practice. And both arrive at similar conclusions: that reality is not fundamentally material, but informational, that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter, but something more fundamental, that the observer and observed are not separate, but intimately connected. What McKenna added to this conversation was the insistence that certain plant medicines provide a shortcut, a rapid and direct access to these insights that might otherwise take decades of contemplative practice to achieve. He wasn't dismissing other paths. He was simply pointing out that these substances exist, that they reliably produce these states, and that indigenous cultures have been using them for exactly this purpose for thousands of years. Our culture's blanket prohibition on these substances, he argued, is not based on any genuine understanding of their effects or dangers. It's based on a profound cultural anxiety about non-ordinary states of consciousness, about experiences that don't fit into our materialistic worldview. The symbolic language that becomes perceptible in these states is not random or chaotic. It has structure, grammar, rules, though these are very different from the rules of ordinary language. McKenna spent years trying to understand this structure, to map its contours, to develop something like a linguistics of the ineffable. He noticed, for instance, that the experience often involves what he called the teaching voice, an entity or presence that seems to be trying to communicate important information, often about the nature of reality itself or about the experiencer's personal life and development. This teaching voice doesn't speak in words, yet its communication is perfectly clear. It might manifest as a geometric pattern that unfolds to reveal layers of meaning. It might appear as a vision of symbolic significance that bypasses rational understanding and imprints itself directly on your consciousness. It might come as a sudden influx of knowing, an understanding that arrives complete and whole rather than being built up piece by piece through logical reasoning. The content is often described as hyperlogical rather than illogical, as if it's employing a more sophisticated form of reasoning than our everyday linear thinking. People who encounter this teaching presence often report a sense of coming home, of remembering something they always knew but had forgotten. This is the felt presence of direct experience, the immediate, undeniable recognition that you are in the presence of something vastly more intelligent and knowledgeable than your everyday self. And yet, paradoxically, it doesn't feel alien or foreign. It feels intimately familiar, as if you're meeting a part of yourself that you'd lost touch with, as if you're remembering your true nature. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of McKenna's teaching. His suggestion that the entities encountered in deep psychedelic space might be genuinely autonomous beings rather than projections of the personal psyche. He acknowledged that he couldn't prove this, that it might be impossible to prove. But he insisted that the experiences themselves have a quality of otherness, of genuine encounter with something independent, that is very difficult to explain away as mere hallucination or psychological projection. From the perspective of consensus reality, this seems absurd. These experiences are happening inside your head, produced by molecules interacting with receptors in your brain. How could there be actual entities involved? But McKenna would counter that this objection assumes what it needs to prove, that consciousness is generated by brains, that experience is confined to skulls, that the subjective is merely a byproduct of the objective. If consciousness is instead fundamental, if mind is not produced by matter, but is the ground in which matter appears, then the sharp distinction between inner and outer, between psychological and ontological, starts to blur. Perhaps the entities are both psychological and real. Perhaps they emerge from the collective unconscious, but have genuine autonomy nonetheless. Perhaps consciousness, at deeper levels, is not personal but transpersonal, and what we encounter in these states are aspects of our larger self, dimensions of consciousness that are normally inaccessible, but that become perceptible when the filters of ordinary waking consciousness are removed. The either-or thinking that characterizes our culture, the insistence that something must be either subjective or objective, either real or imaginary, might simply be inadequate to the nature of these experiences. What's not in question is the pragmatic value of these encounters. People who have them often return with profound insights, with solutions to problems they'd been wrestling with a renewed sense of meaning and purpose. The entities, whether they're autonomous beings or deep aspects of the psyche, function as teachers, guides, allies in the process of development and awakening. They provide what McKenna called a boundary dissolution experience that allows you to see beyond the confines of your usual identity and to recognize yourself as something vaster, more mysterious, more connected than you normally imagine. This dissolution of boundaries is perhaps the central teaching of the Logos, the core message that it's trying to communicate through all its various means. The boundaries that we take to be solid and real, between self and other, between mind and matter, between human and nature, between the mundane and the sacred, are all permeable, provisional, ultimately illusory. They're useful for certain purposes, for navigating the world of form, but they're not ultimate truths. And when we mistake them for ultimate truths, when we forget that they're constructs rather than givens, we cut ourselves off from the larger reality that we're embedded in. The felt presence of direct experience returns us to a recognition of our participation in this larger reality. It's not that the individual self is negated or destroyed. It's that it's revealed to be a partial perspective, one viewing point among infinite possibilities, rather than a separate entity struggling to survive in an indifferent universe. This shift in perspective is tremendously liberating. The anxiety that comes from feeling separate, isolated, existentially alone, begins to dissolve when you recognize that you've never actually been separate, that the isolation was an illusion created by identifying exclusively with the surface level of your being. McKenna often spoke about the importance of what he called consciousness expansion, but he didn't mean this in a vague, new agey sense. He meant it quite literally. The expansion of your identity beyond the boundaries of the personal ego to include wider and wider circles of being. First, you expand to recognize your continuity with other humans, that we're all expressions of the same consciousness wearing different masks. Then you expand further to recognize your continuity with all life, that the same awareness that looks out through your eyes is looking out through every creature. Then you expand even further to recognize your continuity with matter itself, with the entire cosmos, with the Logos that is continuously speaking everything into existence. This progressive expansion of identity is not a belief or a philosophy. It's a direct experiential recognition that becomes possible when the filters of ordinary consciousness are removed. And once you've had even a glimpse of this expanded awareness, it becomes impossible to fully return to the prison of the separate self. You've seen through the illusion, at a level deeper than belief, that you are not who you thought you were. You are something far more interesting, far more vast, far more intimately connected to everything than you ever imagined. The challenge, then, is integration. It's one thing to have a profound experience of cosmic consciousness, of the felt presence of direct experience, of communion with the Logos. It's another thing entirely to bring that experience back into ordinary life and allow it to transform how you live day to day. Many people have powerful psychedelic experiences or mystical breakthroughs, only to find that within weeks or months, they've slipped back into their old patterns, their old ways of thinking and being. The experience becomes just a memory, however beautiful or significant, rather than a catalyst for genuine transformation. McKenna was acutely aware of this problem. He recognized that the psychedelic experience, for all its power, is temporary. The substances wear off. You return to ordinary consciousness. And while you may have been given a glimpse of the larger reality, a taste of liberation, the question is what you do with that glimpse. Do you dismiss it as a drug-induced aberration, interesting but ultimately unreal? Do you cling to it as the only valid reality and become unable to function in the consensus world? Or do you find a way to integrate it, to allow the insights to filter down into your everyday life and gradually transform how you perceive and engage with reality? This integration is the real work. The psychedelic experience is easy in a sense. You take the substance and the experience happens to you. You don't have to do anything except surrender and pay attention. But integration requires ongoing effort, discipline, practice. It requires that you take the insights seriously enough to actually change your life in accordance with them. If you have an experience of the illusory nature of the separate self, but then continue to live as if you are a separate self, constantly defending your ego and competing with others, then the experience hasn't really transformed you. It's just been a fascinating vacation from your usual consciousness. True integration means developing practices that keep you connected to the felt presence even in the midst of ordinary life. This might be a daily meditation practice, time spent in contemplation or in nature, creative work that allows the logos to flow through you. Service to others that reminds you of your interconnection. Whatever the specific practices, the point is to keep the channel open, to maintain your sensitivity to the symbolic communication of the universe, even when you're not in an altered state. McKenna advocated what he called the examined life, borrowing Socrates' famous phrase but giving it a psychedelic twist. An examined life, in McKenna's terms, is one where you're constantly checking your assumptions, constantly questioning the consensus reality, constantly testing your experience against the insights that have come to you in non-ordinary states. It's a life lived with curiosity and wonder, rather than cynicism and certainty. It's a willingness to remain open to mystery, to accept that you don't have all the answers, that reality is stranger and more multidimensional than any single perspective can capture. This openness is crucial because the universe's communication is ongoing. It's not a one-time download of information that you then spend the rest of your life unpacking. It's a continuous conversation, a dynamic relationship that evolves as you evolve. The logos that spoke to you yesterday may have something different to say today. The symbolic language is context-dependent, responsive to your current state of development and to the questions you're asking, consciously or unconsciously. This is why McKenna emphasized the importance of what he called setting intention before a psychedelic session. You're not just taking a drug to get high or to have interesting hallucinations. You're entering into a dialogue with something larger than yourself, and like any meaningful dialogue, it benefits from clarity about what you're hoping to learn or experience. This doesn't mean rigidly controlling the experience. It means approaching it with respect and purpose, as you would approach any encounter with a teacher or guide. The same principle applies to life generally. When you approach each day with intention, with a question or focus, you become more sensitive to the ways that the universe responds. The synchronicities become more obvious. The symbolic language becomes easier to read. You start to notice that life itself has a quality of intelligence, of responsiveness, that it's not just a series of random events, but a meaningful unfolding in which you are both participant and observer. McKenna sometimes spoke about this as surfing the wave of novelty. He believed that reality is not entropic, not winding down into heat death and chaos as thermodynamics suggests. Rather, it's becoming increasingly complex, increasingly novel, accelerating toward what he called the eschaton, the endpoint or omega point where novelty becomes infinite. Whether or not you buy into this specific theory, the underlying insight is valuable. That life is characterized by increasing complexity, and that we can either resist this flow toward novelty, or we can align ourselves with it, learn to move with it, to surf it. Surfing requires a delicate balance. You can't control the wave. If you try to dominate it, to force it to do what you want, you'll wipe out. But you also can't be completely passive. If you just go limp, you'll be tumbled by the wave and dragged under. You have to find that sweet spot where you're responding to the wave's energy, working with it, using its power, while also applying your own skill and intuition. This is a perfect metaphor for how to live in relationship with the Logos. You don't control it, but you're not helpless before it either. You participate, you dance with it. This participatory relationship with the universe is radically different from both religious fundamentalism and scientific materialism. Fundamentalism says, God has spoken, the truth is revealed, your job is to obey. Materialism says, the universe is dead matter, consciousness is an illusion, meaning is something you project onto an indifferent cosmos. But the view that emerges from direct experience of the Logos is neither of these. It says, the universe is alive and aware, it's communicating with you constantly, and you have agency in how you respond. You're not a passive recipient of divine commands, but neither are you an isolated ego struggling against entropic decay. You're a co-creator, a participant in an ongoing improvisation. This is tremendously empowering, but also tremendously challenging. It means you can't outsource responsibility for your life to religious authorities or scientific experts. You have to develop your own relationship with the mystery, your own fluency in the symbolic language, your own capacity to navigate by the felt presence rather than by external rules or certainties. You have to become, in a sense, your own shaman, your own priest, your own scientist, integrating all these roles into a more comprehensive way of being. McKenna was suspicious of gurus and spiritual authorities who claimed to have all the answers, who promised enlightenment if you just followed their system or bought their program. He saw this as another form of the infantilization that characterizes our culture, another way of keeping people dependent and disempowered. True spiritual maturity, in his view, means taking full responsibility for your own consciousness, for your own relationship with the cosmos. It means doing the work yourself rather than expecting someone else to do it for you. But this doesn't mean going it entirely alone. Part of what makes psychedelic exploration so valuable, McKenna believed, is that it provides peer verification. When different people, from different cultures, at different times, all report similar experiences and encounters, when the phenomenology is consistent enough to be mapped and discussed, then we can reasonably conclude that we're dealing with something real, something that exists independently of individual psychology. The fact that the DMT entities, for instance, are reported with such consistency that they have similar characteristics and behaviors across thousands of trip reports suggests that we're not just dealing with random hallucinations. This peer verification is a kind of empiricism, but it's an empiricism of consciousness rather than an empiricism of material objects. It says, let's take subjective experience seriously as data. Let's compare notes. Let's see what patterns emerge when we systematically explore these altered states. This is, in fact, exactly what indigenous shamanic traditions have been doing for millennia. They've developed sophisticated maps of non-ordinary reality based on thousands of years of accumulated experience. Our culture's dismissal of this knowledge as primitive superstition is a form of profound arrogance, McKenna argued. These people know things about consciousness that we've forgotten or never learned. As we go deeper into understanding how the universe communicates, we come to what might be the most challenging and most important insight: that the message is inseparable from the medium. The universe doesn't have a message that it's trying to convey using the symbolic language as a vehicle. The symbolic language is itself the message. Reality is not pointing at something beyond itself. It is what it means. This is the ultimate non-dualism, the final dissolving of the boundary between map and territory, between signifier and signified. This is extraordinarily difficult for the Western mind to grasp, because we've been so thoroughly trained in dualistic thinking. We assume that there's a real world out there, and then there are our representations of that world, our maps and models and languages, and we spend enormous effort trying to make our representations more accurate, more closely aligned with the reality they represent. But what McKenna encountered in the depths of psychedelic space was the collapse of this entire framework. There was no gap between the experience and what it meant. The experience was its own meaning, complete and self-sufficient. This is what's really meant by the felt presence of direct experience. It's not an experience of something. It's not a representation. It's a presentation. It's reality presenting itself directly, without mediation. And in that direct presentation, the question of whether it's real or illusory doesn't arise, because those categories depend on the subject-object split that has been transcended. You're not observing reality. You are reality observing itself. Philosophers have struggled with this for centuries. Kant distinguished between the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it, and the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself, and concluded that we can never know the noumenal world, that we're forever trapped in our phenomenal representations. But what the mystics throughout history have maintained, and what McKenna's explorations seem to confirm, is that this is not quite right. There is a mode of knowing that transcends representation, that is not mediated by concepts or language or sensory data. It's a direct knowing, an immediate participation in reality that doesn't create a gap between knower and known. This is gnosis in the original sense, not belief or intellectual understanding, but direct experiential knowledge of the divine nature of reality. It's what the Zen masters are pointing at with their koans and their paradoxes, trying to short-circuit the conceptual mind so that direct seeing can occur. It's what the Christian mystics meant by union with God, not a merger of two separate things, but a recognition that there were never two things to begin with, that the apparent separation was the illusion. McKenna's contribution was to demonstrate that certain molecules can facilitate this recognition in ways that are reliable and repeatable. This is not to say that psychedelics are necessary or that they're the only or best path, but they are a path, and they're a path that works for a lot of people, particularly in our current culture, where we've lost most of the traditional methods for inducing these states. The psychedelic experience can jumpstart the process, can give you a reference point, can show you what's possible so that you know what you're aiming for with other practices. But here's where we need to be very careful. The goal is not to become dependent on substances, not to need a molecule to access the deeper dimensions of reality. The goal is to use the substances as training wheels, as teachers that show you your own capacity for expanded consciousness, and then to develop that capacity through your own efforts. The felt presence of direct experience is always available, McKenna insisted. It's the ground of being. It's what you are at the deepest level. The substances don't create it. They just remove the filters that normally obscure it. This is crucial to understand because otherwise, psychedelics become just another form of escapism, another way of avoiding the real work of transformation. If you're using substances to escape from the difficulties of your life, to avoid feeling your pain or dealing with your problems, then you're not really engaging with them properly. The proper use of psychedelics, McKenna believed, is as sacraments, as tools for spiritual development, as allies in the process of awakening. And awakening ultimately is not about having interesting experiences. It's about recognizing your true nature and living in alignment with that recognition. The symbolic language of the universe, when properly understood, is always pointing back to this recognition. Every synchronicity, every dream, every mystical experience, every encounter with the other in psychedelic space, all of it is saying the same thing in different ways. Wake up. Remember what you are. Recognize that you're not a separate fragment of consciousness, struggling to survive in an alien universe. You are the universe experiencing itself, playing all the roles, writing all the stories, speaking all the languages, including the wordless language that underlies them all. This recognition doesn't make everyday life less important. If anything, it makes it more important because you realize that there is no separation between the sacred and the mundane, between the spiritual and the material. Everything is equally an expression of the Logos. The universe is speaking to you not just in dramatic mystical experiences, but in every moment of every day. If you take it seriously, you can't help but become more conscious, more deliberate, more attentive to the symbolic dimension of experience. You start to recognize that everything is significant, everything is communication. The pattern of light through leaves, the timing of a phone call, the book that falls off the shelf at just the right moment, the stranger who says exactly what you needed to hear, the obstacle that forces you to change direction. All of it is the universe speaking to you, responding to you, participating with you in the unfolding of your life. But again, this is not a message in the ordinary sense. It's not information being transmitted from a sender to a receiver. It's more like the way your left hand knows what your right hand is doing without any message being sent. It's the coherence of a single system with itself, the universe maintaining its self-consistency, its integrity. When you're aligned with this flow, when you're sensitive to the symbolic language, life takes on a quality of grace, of rightness, even in the midst of difficulty. You trust the process because you recognize that it's not happening to you. It's happening as you. You are the process. This is what McKenna ultimately discovered and spent his life trying to communicate. That we are not observers of the universe, but organs of the universe. Ways that it knows itself. Ways that it articulates itself into manifestation. The Logos speaks through us and as us. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself, and in that consciousness, recognizing its own nature as pure creativity, pure freedom, pure possibility. Every act of genuine creativity, every moment of true presence, every gesture of love or compassion or courage is the Logos expressing itself, reality celebrating its own existence. And if this sounds grandiose or mystical, or too good to be true, McKenna would say, don't take my word for it. Try it. Do the experiment. Take the journey. Enter the depths of your own consciousness and see what you find there. Not to escape reality, but to discover what reality actually is beneath the surface of appearances. Not to have impressive experiences to brag about, but to transform your understanding of what and who you are. Not to join a cult or adopt a belief system, but to develop direct knowledge, gnosis, the felt presence of direct experience that cannot be doubted, because it's more real than anything you've ever known. There's a particular quality to McKenna's vision that sets it apart from both traditional mysticism and modern spirituality, and it has to do with his insistence on the strange, the bizarre, the genuinely alien nature of what we encounter when we push consciousness to its limits. He was deeply suspicious of spiritual teachings that present enlightenment as a kind of peaceful merging into oneness, a dissolution into bliss where all distinctions disappear. His experiences suggested something far weirder, far more complex, far more interesting. The entities encountered in deep DMT space, for instance, are not serene or ethereal. They're wildly creative, playfully bizarre, sometimes even mischievous or trickster-like. They don't speak in platitudes about love and light. They demonstrate incredible technologies of consciousness. They juggle impossible objects. They transform themselves into increasingly complex and beautiful forms. They seem to delight in showing off the flexibility of reality. They're more like circus performers or jazz musicians than like the solemn gurus and angels that populate conventional spiritual imagery. This emphasis on the weird is crucial because it suggests that the universe is not just conscious, but creative, not just aware, but playful, not just intelligent, but possessed of something like humor. The Logos is not a stern lawgiver or a cosmic accountant keeping track of sins and merits. It's more like a master improviser, riffing endlessly on themes, generating novelty for the sheer joy of it. Reality, in this view, is less like a clockwork mechanism and more like a jazz session, where the players are constantly responding to each other, building on what's come before, taking risks, exploring possibilities. McKenna believed that this creative, improvisational quality is fundamental to the nature of reality, and that we, as conscious beings, inherit this quality. We are not just passive observers, or even just co-creators. We are fully empowered agents of creativity, capable of introducing genuine novelty into the universe through our choices and actions. This is a radically empowering vision, but it also comes with responsibility. If we're genuinely free, if we're genuinely creative, then we're also accountable for what we create, for the kind of world we bring into being through our thoughts and actions. The symbolic language that the universe speaks is inviting us into this creative dance, but it's not telling us what to do. It's not providing a script or a set of rules. It's more like it's showing us the moves, demonstrating possibilities, inspiring us with visions of what could be, and then stepping back to see what we'll do with it. This is why the psychedelic experience so often has a quality of being educational, of being shown something important. The entities are teachers, but they're not authoritarian teachers. They're more like mentors or coaches, encouraging you to discover your own capacities, to surprise yourself with what you're capable of. This brings us back to the question of language and why ordinary language is so inadequate for capturing these experiences. Language, as we normally use it, is designed for a world of separate objects with fixed properties, a world where things stay in their categories and behave predictably. But the world revealed by the psychedelic experience, the world of the Logos, is not like that at all. It's fluid, protean, constantly transforming. Meanings shift, forms morph. What seemed solid becomes transparent. What seemed separate reveals itself as intimately connected. Trying to talk about this in ordinary language is like trying to describe a symphony using only the vocabulary of plumbing. The words just don't fit. This is why McKenna's language, when he was at his best, had a quality of poetry, of myth-making, of reaching for metaphors and neologisms, because the existing vocabulary simply wasn't adequate. He was trying to create what he called a new software for consciousness, a new way of talking and thinking that could better accommodate the realities revealed in non-ordinary states. This is not just an academic or philosophical issue. It's intensely practical. The way we talk about reality shapes the reality we experience. If our language only has categories for matter and mechanism, for objects and causation, then that's the world we'll see. But if we can develop a language that also includes categories for consciousness and creativity, for synchronicity and meaning, for the symbolic and the numinous, then we open up space for experiencing those dimensions of reality that have been systematically excluded by our culture's dominant worldview. McKenna saw the psychedelic experience as potentially revolutionizing not just individual consciousness, but culture itself. If enough people had direct experience of the larger reality, of the logos and its communications, then the consensus trance that keeps us locked in a narrow materialistic worldview would begin to dissolve. We would collectively remember what indigenous cultures have never forgotten, that we live in an ensouled universe, that consciousness permeates reality, that we are in continuous communion with intelligences both human and more than human. This is not a call to abandon reason or science or return to some imagined golden age of pre-rational thinking. McKenna was himself deeply rational, well-read in science and philosophy, committed to evidence and rigorous thinking. But he recognized that rationality, as currently practiced in our culture, is too narrow. It excludes vast domains of experience that are every bit as real as the physical world it studies. The challenge is to expand rationality, to develop what we might call a psychedelic rationality that can accommodate both the objective world of material causation and the subjective world of meaning and consciousness. This expanded rationality would recognize that there are different kinds of truth that require different methods of investigation. Physical truth requires the methods of science, observation, measurement, experimentation, mathematical modeling. But psychological truth, spiritual truth, existential truth, these require different approaches. They require introspection, meditation, direct experience, interpretation of symbols. Neither mode is superior to the other. They're complementary ways of knowing, each appropriate to its domain. The tragedy of modernity is that we've elevated one mode of knowing, scientific rationality, to the status of the only valid knowledge, and dismissed all other modes as mere subjectivity, as opinion or belief or superstition. This has impoverished our lives in ways we barely recognize because we've lived with this impoverishment for so long. We've lost touch with the soul, with meaning, with the sacred dimension of existence. And no amount of scientific progress or technological advancement can compensate for this loss, because these things operate in a different dimension entirely. McKenna's vision was of a culture that could integrate both modes of knowing, that could be both technologically sophisticated and spiritually alive, both scientifically rigorous and open to mystery. He saw the psychedelic experience as a key to this integration because it bridges the two worlds. It's a physical phenomenon, molecules interacting with receptors, that produces metaphysical insights. It's material causation leading to spiritual revelation. It demonstrates that matter and mind, body and soul, science and spirituality are not opposed but intimately connected, different aspects of a single, unified reality. The universe speaks to us through this unified reality, through the seamless integration of the physical and the metaphysical, the material and the meaningful. When we fragment reality into separate domains and privilege one over the other, we lose the ability to hear the full message. We get noise instead of signal, confusion instead of clarity. But when we approach experience whole, when we're willing to honor both the measurable and the meaningful, both the objective and the subjective, then the symbolic language becomes clear. The universe is not speaking in riddles. We've just been listening with only half our attention, using only half our faculties. As we come toward an understanding of what it means to live in conscious relationship with the Logos, with the speaking universe, we need to address something that McKenna was always careful to emphasize. This is not passive reception. The universe is not broadcasting a message that you simply receive if you tune to the right frequency. It's more accurate to say that the universe is generating a field of possibilities, and you participate in actualizing specific possibilities through your attention, your intention, your choices. This is where quantum mechanics becomes relevant, though we have to be careful not to fall into New Age misappropriations of quantum theory. What quantum physics actually demonstrates is that observation affects what is observed, that consciousness plays a role in determining which potential becomes actual. Before measurement, a quantum system exists in superposition, in multiple states simultaneously. The act of observation collapses this superposition into a single, definite state. Now, the implications of this for consciousness are still hotly debated, but at minimum, it suggests that the old Newtonian view of a universe of definite objects existing independently of observation is not correct. McKenna saw in this a scientific validation of something the mystics have always known, that consciousness and reality are not separate, that we participate in creating the world we experience. This doesn't mean that reality is whatever you want it to be, that you can simply think your way into a different world. But it does mean that the world is not fixed and determined independently of consciousness. There's a participatory dimension. Your attention, your focus, your state of consciousness, all of these influence what aspects of reality become manifest, what possibilities become actualized. This is operating at every level, from the quantum to the psychological to the social. At the psychological level, it's obvious. What you pay attention to grows in your experience. If you're constantly focusing on problems and dangers, your world becomes full of problems and dangers. If you train your attention on beauty and possibility, you start to notice more beauty and possibility. This isn't just subjective. Your state of consciousness actually influences what happens to you, what opportunities appear, what synchronicities manifest. At the social level, the same principle applies. The collective consciousness of a society determines what that society considers real and possible. If everyone agrees that something is impossible, it becomes functionally impossible within that context. But if enough people start to imagine and believe in different possibilities, those possibilities can become real. This is how cultural change happens, through shifts in collective consciousness that open up new potentials. The symbolic language of the universe is participating in this process, constantly showing us possibilities we hadn't considered, connections we hadn't noticed, patterns we hadn't recognized. It's not determining what will happen. It's showing us what could happen, inspiring us, guiding us, but always leaving the final choice to us. This is the meaning of free will in a universe that is itself conscious and intentional. It's not that we're separate from the universe making autonomous choices. It's that we are the universe choosing through our particular perspective, the universe exploring possibilities through our agency. McKenna had a wonderful phrase for this. He said we are the universe looking at itself through billions of eyes. Each of us is a unique vantage point, a unique possibility of experience, a unique way that consciousness can know itself. And the diversity of these perspectives is not a bug, but a feature. The universe wants to experience itself in as many ways as possible, to explore every variation, every combination, every possible pattern of organization. This is why there's such incredible diversity in nature, why evolution generates ever more complex and varied forms. It's not random mutation and selection, it's the logos playing with forms, exploring possibilities, generating novelty. And we, as conscious beings, inherit this drive toward novelty and complexity. We're not content with mere survival or reproduction. We want meaning, beauty, growth, transcendence. We create art and music and philosophy and mathematics, things that have no obvious survival value, but that express our participation in the creative unfolding of the cosmos. These activities are not frivolous or secondary. They're expressions of our deepest nature as organs of the universe's self-knowledge and self-creation. When you create something genuinely new, whether it's a work of art or a scientific theory, or a way of life or a relationship, you're participating in the universe's creative process. You're bringing into manifestation something that didn't exist before, a new pattern, a new possibility. And in doing so, you're responding to the call of the Logos, which is always inviting us to greater creativity, greater consciousness, greater realization of potential. This is what the felt presence of direct experience is ultimately pointing toward: your own creative potential, your own capacity to participate consciously in the evolutionary process. The entities in psychedelic space, the synchronicities in waking life, the dreams and intuitions and inspirations, all of these are the universe saying, look what's possible, look what you're capable of. Don't settle for the consensus reality. Don't accept the limitations that your culture tries to impose. You are far more than you've been told. You are a creative force. Use it. But there's a paradox here that McKenna was always wrestling with. On one hand, we have genuine agency, genuine creative power. On the other hand, we're not separate from the larger whole. We're not isolated egos making autonomous choices. We're expressions of the Logos, instruments through which it manifests. So where do we end and the universe begin? Who is actually doing the choosing, the creating? The answer, McKenna suggested, is that this is a false dichotomy. The assumption that there must be either determinism or free will, either cosmic control or individual autonomy, is based on the illusion of separation. Once you recognize that you are the universe, that there is no boundary between your consciousness and cosmic consciousness, then the question dissolves. When you choose, the universe chooses. When the universe acts, you act. There is no conflict because there are not two things that could come into conflict. This is extraordinarily liberating once you really get it. It means you can stop trying to control everything, stop trying to figure everything out, stop the exhausting effort of the ego to maintain its separate existence and defend its territory. You can relax into the larger intelligence that you are, trust the process, allow yourself to be moved by something greater than your small, conscious self. And paradoxically, when you stop trying to control, you become more effective, more creative, more aligned with what's actually trying to happen through you. This is what it means to live in conscious relationship with the speaking universe. It's not passive or fatalistic. You don't just wait for signs and omens to tell you what to do, but neither are you the lonely, autonomous decision maker that Western individualism imagines. You're a participant in a dialogue, a partner in a dance, a voice in an endless improvisation. You listen for what's trying to emerge, what wants to come through you, and you lend your energy and attention to helping it manifest. The symbolic language becomes clearer as you develop this way of being. You start to recognize the patterns, to feel the flow, to sense when you're aligned and when you're resisting. Life becomes less effortful because you're working with the grain of reality rather than against it. This doesn't mean everything becomes easy or that you never face challenges. But the challenges themselves are recognized as part of the teaching, part of the communication, opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to happiness. McKenna's life embodied this principle. He didn't have a conventional career or a predictable path. He followed his curiosity, his passion, his sense of what was important and meaningful. He trusted the process even when it led him into strange territories, even when he couldn't see where it was going. And in doing so, he became a unique voice, a cultural catalyst, someone who helped thousands of people expand their understanding of what's possible. He became, in his own words, a bard, someone who speaks for the Logos, who translates its communications into language that others can hear and be inspired by. This is available to all of us, not necessarily in the form of public teaching or cultural influence, but in whatever form is appropriate to our unique gifts and circumstances. The universe is speaking to you specifically, calling you to your specific role in the unfolding of the whole. The question is whether you're listening, whether you're willing to trust what you hear, whether you're brave enough to follow where it leads. We arrive, finally, at what might be the most important and most challenging teaching: that the universe's communication is not meant to comfort you or make you feel special or validate your existing beliefs and assumptions. It's meant to transform you, to break you open, to shatter the limited conception you have of yourself and reality so that something larger can emerge. This is why the genuine mystical experience, the real encounter with the Logos, is often described in terms of death and rebirth, of ego death and renewal. McKenna was clear about this. He didn't sugarcoat the psychedelic experience or present it as a pleasant escape from ordinary reality. He described it as challenging, demanding, often terrifying. In the depths of a high-dose psilocybin journey, you might feel like you're dying, like you're losing your mind, like everything you thought was real is dissolving into chaos. This is not a bug in the experience. It's the central feature. You have to die to who you thought you were in order to discover who you actually are. This ego death is not a metaphor. It's a literal experience of the dissolution of the boundaries that define your ordinary sense of self. The voice in your head that constantly narrates your experience, that judges and analyzes and plans and worries, falls silent. The sense of being a separate individual with a personal history and a particular identity evaporates. What remains is just pure awareness, consciousness without content, the felt presence without any specific form. This is terrifying for the ego, because the ego is convinced that it is you, that its dissolution means your annihilation. But what you discover, if you can surrender into the experience rather than resisting it, is that the ego's death is not your death. Something much larger remains, something that was there all along, but that you couldn't perceive because the ego was too loud, too insistent, too convinced of its own importance. This larger something is what you actually are, your true nature beneath all the conditioning and identification and stories about yourself. Different traditions have different names for this: Buddha nature, Christ consciousness, Atman, the self with a capital S, pure awareness. McKenna simply called it consciousness itself, the ground of being, the logos. The specific terminology doesn't matter. What matters is the recognition that you are not what you thought you were. You are not the ego self with its limited perspective and its constant anxieties. You are the consciousness in which that ego self appears, the space in which all experience unfolds, the awareness that is aware of everything including itself. This recognition is the ultimate message that the universe is trying to communicate. Everything else, the entities, the visions, the synchronicities, the symbolic language, all of it is trying to point you toward this fundamental recognition. You are not a small, separate fragment of consciousness looking out at an alien universe. You are the consciousness that is the universe, experiencing itself from a particular point of view. This is not a belief or a philosophy. It's a direct, immediate knowing that becomes possible when the filters of ordinary consciousness are removed. And once you've had even a glimpse of this recognition, everything changes. You can't go back to the innocence of believing that you're just a skin-encapsulated ego struggling to survive in an indifferent world. You know better now. You've seen through the illusion. The question then becomes, what do you do with this knowledge? How do you integrate it? How do you live in a way that honors this deeper truth? This is the challenge that McKenna issued to his listeners and readers. Don't just have interesting experiences and then go back to business as usual. Let the experiences transform you. Let the recognition of your true nature restructure how you live, how you relate to others, how you engage with the world. This is not easy. It requires ongoing effort, ongoing practice, ongoing commitment to consciousness and growth. It means constantly questioning your assumptions, constantly pushing against the comfortable boundaries of your known world, constantly opening to novelty and challenge. It also means accepting responsibility in a new way. If you are the universe experiencing itself, if there is no ultimate distinction between you and the larger whole, then you're responsible not just for your own little life, but for the larger pattern that you're embedded in. Your choices matter not just for you, but for the whole. How you live, what consciousness you bring, what you create or destroy, all of it ripples out into the larger field in ways you can't fully predict or control, but that nonetheless have real effects. McKenna saw this clearly in the context of our current global crisis, the ecological destruction, the social fragmentation, the sense that we're rushing towards some kind of collapse or transformation. He believed that we're at a critical juncture in human evolution, a point where we either wake up collectively or face dire consequences. The universe is speaking to us with increasing urgency, he suggested, through environmental catastrophes, through social upheavals, through the intensifying strangeness of contemporary experience. It's saying, pay attention. Change is necessary. Business as usual is not an option. But the change that's needed is not primarily technological or political, though those dimensions matter. The fundamental change needed is in consciousness itself, in how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the larger whole. We need to move from a consciousness of separation, competition, and domination to a consciousness of interconnection, cooperation, and partnership. We need to remember that we're not separate from nature, but expressions of nature, that the earth is not a resource to be exploited, but a living being of which we are organs. This shift in consciousness is precisely what the psychedelic experience, properly understood, facilitates. It dissolves the illusion of separation and returns us to a recognition of our fundamental unity with all life. It shows us that the boundaries we've drawn are provisional and permeable, that we are far more connected than we typically imagine. And in that recognition, something shifts in how we live and act. We can't treat others, human or non-human, with the same callousness when we recognize them as expressions of the same consciousness that we are. This is why McKenna believed that the psychedelic experience could be part of the solution to our civilizational crisis. Not because psychedelics will fix our problems directly, but because they can catalyze the shift in consciousness that makes real solutions possible. They can break us out of the consensus trance, the shared hallucination that keeps us locked in destructive patterns. They can remind us of what we are and what we could be, of possibilities we've forgotten or never imagined. But this requires that we approach these substances with appropriate respect and intention. They are not party drugs or tools for escapism. They are sacraments, powerful tools for transformation that must be used responsibly and reverently. Indigenous cultures have always understood this. They've developed elaborate protocols and contexts for their use, recognizing that how you approach the experience determines what you get from it. Our culture's casual recreational approach to psychedelics misses the point entirely and can even be dangerous. What we need, McKenna argued, is something like a psychedelic culture, a society that recognizes the value of altered states of consciousness and integrates them into the larger cultural framework in responsible ways. This doesn't mean everyone should or must use psychedelics. Different people are called to different paths, and psychedelics are not appropriate or necessary for everyone. But it does mean that our culture should stop demonizing and prohibiting these substances, should recognize them as valid tools for exploration and healing and growth, and should allow adults to make informed choices about their use. The prohibition of psychedelics is itself a symptom of our culture's sickness, McKenna believed. It reflects our deep anxiety about consciousness, our fear of experiences that don't fit into our narrow materialistic worldview, our need to control and regulate every aspect of human experience. But consciousness is the last frontier, the dimension of reality that cannot be fully controlled or regulated, because it's what we most fundamentally are. Trying to prohibit altered states is like trying to prohibit breathing or dreaming. It's absurd and doomed to failure. The universe is speaking to us, McKenna insisted, with increasing urgency and clarity. The question is whether we're listening, whether we're willing to hear what it's saying, whether we're brave enough to act on what we learn. The message is not comfortable or reassuring. It's challenging, demanding, calling us to transformation. But it's also hopeful, because it reminds us that we are not helpless victims of circumstances beyond our control. We are creative agents, participants in the ongoing evolution of consciousness. We have the capacity to change, to grow, to transcend our current limitations. The felt presence of direct experience is always available, always calling, always inviting us into deeper recognition and fuller participation. It speaks in the language of symbols and synchronicities, of dreams and visions, of beauty and terror, of mystery and meaning. It doesn't speak in words because words are too limited, too linear, too constrained by the logic of separation. It speaks in the wordless language of immediate knowing, of direct apprehension, of consciousness recognizing itself in all its forms. This is the teaching. This is the invitation. This is the call that has been sounding since before language, since before thought, since before the emergence of self-conscious awareness. The universe is speaking to you in this very moment, not in words, but in the pure presence of your own awareness, in the mystery of existence itself. Are you listening?